So guys, I just want to say something really quick, bitches, before I start my video, that I'm going to Mexico Arena, so I'm going to have some great food, and see some great museums, and also I'm going to go down to Freedom Cow Museum, and I'm going to go down to Mexico Arena, so it's going to be really awesome, you broke motherfuckers. But after my introduction, I just want to say that off the Mike's Sports Network, he did a video talking about the AEW All In show being subpar, and I'll say this about him that he definitely has conviction. I do like that. Unlike OTR Central, he does have a pattern of just getting on the microphone and talking about things that he feels about AEW and other companies. I think that if you care about being an online content creator, be consistent, and he definitely somebody that I feel has a lot of potential and he's cool for that, but I will say that, I do agree 100% that the build has not been that great. And, if you dissect the three matches and other potential matches, it's not been that good. I do want to do a follow-up video on this, but like you have Mercedes Moné and Toni Storm, and you kind of see like their sexual comedy, and you also see like the lesbian teased type of comedy in this. And then also, you have Mercedes Moné who's wrestling for the CMLL title next week. And honestly, Toni Storm's character is not somebody that screws over, people. So it's not like, she's going to... So if Mercedes loses by interference or the music being played at Toni Storm, that's not going to look good. It may even look better for her to win that title and then say, okay, at AEW All In, we're going to do a winner takes all of every title that they're both holding. But then it looks bad if you do something like that because you make CMLL look bad, you make the Japanese titles that Mercedes hold. I think she's holding the Rev British title as well, really. Then it's like saying, oh, well, these are all just, winner takes all type of thing. So those are two like big elements that the storyline has been really about sexual comedy. They are kind of overdoing the dinner thing, like a lot of comedy. And then there's also really just, the storyline of Mercedes just wanting to win everything, So like I've said, like the basic storyline has to be Toni Storm finding herself and her identity and saying, hey, this is what a real professional wrestler is. A real professional wrestler is somebody with heart. A real professional wrestler is somebody with failure. A real professional wrestler is somebody who wants to, face the next challenge, bring out the best in people. With you, Mercedes, what I see in you, Toni Storm, see in you, somebody who cares about getting all the titles. You just want to win everything, and you just want to win everything, and then just gloat. You want to act like you're better than everybody else, really. You have no sense of thinking about others. You just want to. You don't think about others. You think about your gold. I am somebody who loves this audience. I hold this title for everybody. You just hold this title just because you want to just because you are materialistic. The storyline is materialism, a materialism champion versus a champion with heart. Simple as that, really. That's better than just like steak and lesbianism, So that's kind of like their big issue. So, and I do agree with this. It's story that they have to work on. And I want to explain why they don't do that a little bit later. The next thing that you see is Kenny Omega and Okada, really. And I've kind of said this many times that I'm a little upset with this match because I didn't like how AEW World's End was really just about getting to this match. Like, that's not a good end result. You spend multiple weeks with a wrestling tournament just to get to a match that you're going to have, about 8 months after that show, December to July. And then also too, like, as people are saying, and as Off the Mic pointed out, what is Don Callis in this feud? Because it doesn't make any sense, really, because the problem is that Don Callis is associated with the Don Callis family. The Young Bucks are associated with the Death Riders, and isn't like the Young Bucks and Okada, aren't they all like each other's like best friends? So why isn't Okada using the Don Callis? Why is he using the Don Callis family instead of the Young Bucks? This makes no sense, really. And then the other thing that you have to say with all this is that obviously it's bad because Don Callis is managing like maybe 6 or 7 people, and he doesn't even do that well, really. He talks about Takeshita. It's Takeshita and Kyle Fletcher. And there's like another guy that was like an Aussie Open. That's like a bigger body person. There was Hobbs who was part of it, but then Hobbs left, because he wasn't being managed that well. So, it ultimately is like, he's almost like Tony Khan in a way. He's Mr. being spread too thin and managing all of his responsibilities, really. So it doesn't make sense for him to be having Okada there. So there's a plot hole. And then the other thing is that, this was not a good choice of a main event, really, because shouldn't it be about Hangman Adam Page and Jon Moxley main eventing the 9 o'clock hour of AEW Fighter Fest in Portland, Oregon? Should that be the main event, or should it be Kenny Omega? It does feel like his ego issue is a little out of whack, really. So, it's definitely not that good of a feat. It's definitely, like I said, a dream match, but it doesn't have the right people involved, and the story really should be just about proving who's the best. If they did it was 2 victories and 2 victories, or it should be something like if Okada has more of an edge or Omega has more of an edge, be like, hey, despite my illness, I'll come back and beat you because what have you done? You put no heart in this company. You just stroll around, you're privileged, and then that could be a storyline too, really. Even though I've kind of said Mercedes and Tony could be that thing. You take Okada, who's this privileged, rich kid, rich boy, getting like the celebrity treatment. He's not always having the matches. He's kind of like smug, really. And then you have Omega, who's gone through a lot of like these hardcore death matches, barbed wire death matches. That lights out match where he went through like barbed wire and mouse traps and other things. So you kind of could have that as a story. Heart versus privilege. And then you kind of have another match, which is Hangman versus Moxley. And I understand, and I like what he said, which is that really the interesting element is, the Swerve Strickland and Will Ospreay B story. And I just think that comes down to what we see with Moxley, that he's not that good of a champion. And what's bad about him is that he sounds like a poor man's Bray Wyatt. He sounds like Bray Wyatt bath salts. And then the other thing, too, is that, he really has no character. His character is, I want somebody to prove themselves to me. I want somebody to believe in themselves or lose their opportunity. I want people to step up and defeat me when how can you have that type of expectations of others when your gimmick is when people step up or don't step up, you beat the shit out of them, you have other people cheat. There's really it's just really ambiguous. It's kind of like a word salad, really. So it's almost like a word salad against a guy who wants to have redemption, really. So I really think that the issue is that they don't have the right. I think Hangman has the right, he has the right character, but he doesn't have the right opponent who can tell the right story, really. So that's just, that's kind of like, an issue. He doesn't have the right opponent because Moxley is a word salad, basically, So it would just be like if John Cena was to have a feud with Mr. Iguana. Like if Mr. Grunt can only speak Spanish, and there's no like, there's just nothing to them. Or I would say even like there's been plenty of wrestlers. Like imagine if you had Giant Gonzalez versus John Cena, Giant Gonzalez. Like I think they said back then he just couldn't really speak that well, and he didn't really have He just wasn't. He was, and also too, you saw that ape suit that he wore. Really, you kind of get what I'm saying. It's an example of the dynamics being off, really, and that's kind of what I see with Moxley. And I totally fault Moxley for that. He is somebody, in my opinion, that I feel brings down everybody. When you have a match with Jon Moxley, I think because he's done so much damage and shit to his body that he's super slow. He's sluggish. When you do his matches, they're all the same thing. It's violent spots. Sometimes it's outside, no disqualification bullshit, like swerve with a ladder and him bloodying people and other things. You have all that shit. And that really doesn't... When you do that over and over, it's the same thing. It's almost like when you watch a TNA match, really, when... the 2016 TNA, when a lot of times you have a champion, you have a screwy finish, or you have a bunch of interference. Really, it feels like that type of thing, really. And then also too with the Moxley match is, like I've said, you do have the interference, you do have a lot of the blood, you have moving slow and sluggish, really, and then also too, you have drawn out, you have drawn out interference by like the Death Riders. So I just think that what's hurting it is really John Moxley himself, really. And I think that, like I said, the biggest thing that people are going to want to see is that title coming off of Moxley. And there is a chance that they may not do that because they may say, we got to save for Darby Allin, really, So I think that, as I said, that, Moxley doesn't tell the right stories. They don't even fight that hard in AEW to say, hey, why isn't Hangman Adam Page and Moxley ending every single show? Like the last 3 weeks, mandatorily, it should be mandatory that they end every 3-hour show or 4-hour show that they're doing. It cannot be anybody else. It cannot be Mercedes Moné and Toni Storm. It cannot be, it can't be Kenny Omega and Okada, really. It has to be 100%. It has to be Hangman and Moxley, because that's their biggest story, really. So I just think that, like I said, the issue with AEW is that, and this is where they struggle with, there's so many stories that they can tell, and there are so many stories that could be told a lot better, really. And they have to understand that maybe it's like this, like I think they're at 18,000 out of 50,000 seat arena. That's 36% on a test. That's a failure. In order to get a passing grade, they have to get at least 35,000 people. But the story is what's going to save them, and I think that they don't do that. And one of my biggest, talking points is the fact that I really feel they have way too many special shows. You have AEW Fyter Fest in Denver, AEW Blockbuster in Portland, Oregon, AEW Grand Slam in Mexico. For some reason, you're not advertising. You are sold out 16,000 seat arena. And then also after all that, in a couple of weeks, you have Blockbuster. You have like your 300 episode show. And then you have Death Before Dishonor. And I fucking pray to God, baby, that it's not the pure tournament. Because if you have people pay over $1,000 and it's just pure matches for, so many hours, that's gonna be a killer of Ring of Honor, really. So yeah, part of it is that when they do these special shows, if I'll break it down to you, is that they care way too much about matches. Like, as I said, imagine if you took that 8 hours that they had between the last 2 weeks and you said, hey, we're going to announce some other matches. I see some hints of matches. Like maybe Adam Cole versus Kyle Fletcher. Maybe you do the Hurt Syndicate, faces, maybe faces like Daniel Garcia and Nigel McGuinness, because the Hurt Syndicate are looking for opponents. Or you can do the Don Callis family versus the Ops, or the Ops versus the Death Riders, or you do Marina Shafir versus Will Nightingale. Like, there's some hints of stuff, but there's also some potential matches, really. But imagine if they used all those 8 hours for that. But I think what they're trying to do is that they're trying to have like these really kick-ass special shows, and then what they also have an issue of is when you do back-to-back weeks, like you have 3 weeks in a row of Fyter Fest, Blockbuster, Grand Slam. So the problem is that I think they do these shows to boost ratings, to boost ticket sales, and then what happens with their big show of the year, they may say, hey, we're automatically getting a big crowd, really. So even though we've kind of built these matches, or we care about these extravaganzas, or we have to build up the following special show, really, we're not going to care about leading to the end result, really. And the problem is that it's not that hard, really. Like, look at WWE. They have Royal Rumble. That's a big show. Royal Rumble sets up both WrestleMania and the Elimination Chamber. The Elimination Chamber sets up a bunch of feuds for WrestleMania. So they don't do something like say, hey, well, let's put it this way. At Fyter Fest, what I would do is I would have Okada versus Anthony Bowens. Anthony Bowens beats Okada, and a lot of people are like, wow, holy shit, really. And then the next week they have another match for the title, really. And then you have Anthony Bowens, and you have Max Caster screw Anthony Bowens. and then maybe you restart the match, and then what happens is that Okada beats Anthony Bowens legitimately, or something like that, really. And then what happens is that you set up Anthony Bowens and Max Caster, and you have feuds, and you even have something where maybe you have Max Caster go against Bandito in Mexico Arena because they have a Ring of Honor show. So what if you had Max Caster, the annoying New York guy wearing a Trump hat, saying fresh from Trump Plaza, doing a diss rap in Spanish, and then you have Anthony Bowens, like after you have like Anthony Bowens cost him, and then you see Bandito and Anthony Bowens like taking a belt and whipping his ass really to teach him a lesson about respect really. And then you set out to a match where they fight at AEW All In. You do something like you have Marina Shafir and Willow Nightingale. You have them like do something at Grand Slam this week where you see all the men fight, and then backstage you see Marina. You see Marina come out, and she's like, trying to help out trying to help out her team, and then Willow Nightingale like fights, and then what happens is all the guys are looking at them and they're fighting, and then after like they have their match, really, you see them fight and they're fighting the crowd, and they're like, oh shit, these two bad bitches are out of control, really, and then what happens is security grabs them, and they go to Mexico jail, and they're fighting in the Mexican jail. You see all these prisoners being like, this is one of the baddest jails in the world, really, and then what happens is that you set up, Tony bails them out and says like, okay, you know what, we're going to do a match, a street fight between Marina and Willow Nightingale. You do something like you have the women's division. Like, they're talking about women's tag team titles. What if you had like a multi-week tournament and you had like two matches, two tournament matches on the show, really, on like this, on the 4-hour shows. And then you kind of do something where you're like, okay, you know what? The semifinals is going to happen at AEW Supercard of Honor for people to watch, really. And then the finals will be at the AEW All In. What would happen if Tony Khan announces that there's going to be the casino ladder match, where if I'm the casino going for the gold match, where I believe it's like an over the ropes or it's a pinfall match, if I'm correct, where the winner of that gets an AEW contract anytime, anywhere, and you do multiple weeks of people, like 12 people, talking about how they want to be in it. They're doing qualifying matches, and then you get to, maybe your top 12, and it could be Brody King, Big Cass, Will Ospreay. Now it's like two mystery people, and one person could be Darby Allin, and then the other person could be, maybe Orange Cassidy or somebody who's been out for a long time. I've said this many times. What about a Ring of Honor? You did something like you set up a match between NXM Collection, MXM and Dalton Castle, or MXM and John Morrison versus the Von Erich boys. And they say, hey, in Texas, we're going to take your titles from you. It's not that fucking hard to set of matches. You have Ricochet going around looking for people. What would happen if you actually found some people and saying, like, hey, you know what? I see that Hurt Syndicate, or I see that, those ops, really, or I see Dustin and the Von Erichs. What better way to, get myself over? What better way to embarrass people? What better way to be the biggest heel possible by being the Von Erichs in Texas? So they don't have the ability of multi-week stories in multiple areas. And then if you think about the Attitude Era, if I remember correctly, there was somebody saying that the genius of the Attitude Era was always the fact that there were multi-person matches. There were multi-storylines with everybody. Like the Cruiserweights had a storyline, the tag team people had the storyline, the Intercontinental US, whatever, really. There's always a storyline with everybody. So like I've said, I think, and I've talked to Ricky Starks. I sent him an email about the company. I said like something like, I wish you well in NXT, but I also mentioned to him, like, I feel like with AEW that Tony is afraid to give up power, and I think it's one of those things where he takes on too much. And I think that's the issue, is I think they do two things very poorly. They have 30 writers, so I think that maybe what happens is Tony runs the whole thing, really, and then maybe he has writers, so things are going to be knocked on the wayside when things could have quality. And then when you have 30 writers, we all know this in a writer's room, you never ever have that many writers. You have to say, okay, 10 people for Ring of Honor, 10 people for Dynamite, 10 people for Collision. And then you can say, okay, in addition to that, 5 people for the women's division, 5 people for the Trios division, 5 people for the Continental Unified division, 5 people for the TNT division, 5 people for the women's division, 5 people for the Ring of Honor titles, 5 people for, like the TBS Championship. There needs to be more there's needs to be more spreading of things, and then also Tony gets the final say. But I just think, as I said, that it really stems from a lack of long-term vision, or one person having too much power, or just saying, okay, week to week, we're just going to do back-to-back, blockbuster shows, really, to make it feel like everything's a big deal. But as the old saying goes, if everything feels like a big deal, it ain't a big deal. Another thing that I will say is that I'm 100% proud of AEW for doing this. They've got rid of Battle of the Belts, because that was such a stupid-ass concept, and they always had people lose. But they always treat Battle of the Belts like a blockbuster show, really. So I'm happy they got rid of that. But ultimately, like I said, I think with All In, they don't really get the context that this is a WrestleMania this summer. That's the expectation. That's the AEW WrestleMania. So, I mean, they still have time to build up things. There's still ways they can tie in things. And like I've said, Tony Khan, my nigga, you need to hire me, my nigga. Nigger, you need to hire me, nigga. Because, I can really fix things. I can really turn things around. I know how to tie in things. I know how to say, okay, well, you kind of fucked this thing up. I can unfuck it for you and make it a fuck that we all enjoy, really, as far as the story goes. So, I really think he needs some outside help, really. I really think he also needs somebody that could be his friend and be like, hey, you know what? This is how it should be, and you need to trust me, and I care about. He almost needs to find like a lawyer for him, like a lawyer, like a creative writer lawyer for him. Somebody that's always going to be on his back, somebody that's always going to do what he wants to do, but say, hey, this is the best direction to get there. So he can't, because like with a lawyer, that they're always going to be on your side, really, in most cases when you pay them well. So he needs to find kind of that person to believe in, really, that could help him kind of guide him through the weeks and all that. But like I've said, and I also think that the other issue is that many he probably doesn't understand that with good wrestling, it's almost like a chapter book. You have roughly, if I'm correct, you have roughly about 5 weeks, if I'm correct. If I'm a Scott, you have roughly 4 to 5 weeks before AEW All In. So you have to treat it like like a chapter book. Of okay, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, really, and how we're going to lead up to this. So it's like what I said, really. I just think that when you look at AEW, it's been this consistent thing that I think that they don't really care about long-term storytelling as they used to. They don't care about multi storylines through different shows. They don't even care about using artificial intelligence even to say, hey, what can we do? How can we fix things? Or how can we get the best out of our characters? And I also think that the other thing is that they rely on gags. Honestly, the steak eating and the kiss and the lesbian kissing, that's basically their Conway Twitty gag, So, yeah, the build is subpar, but it's still salvageable. And ultimately, as I said, I think that, like I've said before, and I'll say it again, if you psychoanalyze it, that I think that they have an issue with complacency. They do things the AEW way, and the AEW way is dream matches with not the best build, or sometimes you may say we'll throw in last minute matches. We'll have three dream matches here, but we're gonna have a bunch of matches in the card that are gonna be our lottery ticket matches. If it's a banger, it's a banger. If it's not a banger, it's not a banger. But, do better. I think that they can have so many great matches. Like I've said, Anthony Bowens versus Max Caster, Willow Nightingale versus Marina Shafir street fight. You can do a blood and guts match between the Ops and the Death Riders. Or you can do something like, I've even said, like Eddie Kingston and Gabe Kidd versus Marina Shafir. Eddie Kingston and Willow Nightingale versus Gabe Kidd and Marina Shafir. You could do the Von Erichs versus MXM collection, or MXM and Dalton Castle with John Morrison versus Dustin and the Von Erichs and Sammy Guevara. You could also do Athena having an open challenge, defending her title at a show. You could have Bandito doing an open challenge. Chris Jericho versus Big Cass. People were talking about that. You could also do, as I said, like the Gauntlet for the Gold. Winner gets a title anytime. A title chance against the AEW champion anytime, anywhere. You put Darby Allin in that. You can also do something like Nick Wayne versus Christian Cage. You can do something like, Adam Copeland and Daniel Garcia versus FTR, or you can do like a three-way match, and you can't put in Stokely Hathaway. They have to find like another heel or whatever because Stokely's a joke wrestler. So you can do like a triple threat match of Adam Copeland, Daniel Garcia, and Daniel Garcia, and Nigel McGuinness versus three people, which would be the FTR, and they can find like another wrestler in the company. They can say, "Hey, we'll rent out one of the Don Callis members." You can do MJF and the Hurt Syndicate versus versus like maybe Brody King and like Buddy Matthews, like the House of Black, since like Brody King is somebody that people like, really. You can't do something like do it against the Outrunners because they've been like joke wrestlers. So there is a lot of salvageable things, really. There is so many salvageable things, but they're not doing it. Like, AEW does not live up to its full potential. It's where the best wrestle, but it's not where the best, but they don't bring out the best in their writers.